Welcome to the Mark David Show, where the truth is a conspiracy. Got a great show for you this week, as usual. We're going to start out with some news over there in Europe, poor old Europe. Fitch, this is from Press TV. Fitch, you thought I said a curse word, didn't you? I said Fitch. Cuts Portugal's ratings to junk. That's right. Europe is a bunch of junk. They've given out a bunch of junk paper. Where have you heard that story before? Now, a lot of the stories today, the economic portion of the show, is going to tie in together. Starting with kind of what's happening in Europe. Fitch, by the way, today talked about how, okay, the United States bonds are still rated AAA. However, we think they're about to be junk status. But we're going to do something a little different on the Mark David Show. We're going to do some economic news. We're going to break this show into a couple different chunks, different segments, starting with the economy.
Bear Stearns is fine.
Got a growing economy, jobs, incomes.
$500 billion and you don't know who got the money?
I want a yes or no answer.
No, I'm not going to answer that way.
Our question is who you're working for.
Okay, we're going to start with, hope you like that. We're going to start with German bonds. This is an interesting story. This is from prisonplanet.com, and this is from Paul Craig Roberts, who was the former Undersecretary of Treasury under Reagan. They call him the father of Reaganomics, but if you listen to what he's saying now, I think he's kind of a converted guy, actually. And so anyway, what he says, this is a quote. This is from his story. In my opinion, this is Paul Craig Roberts, the failed German bond auction was orchestrated by the U.S. Treasury. Now, just a reminder, last week, Germany tried to issue some bonds, and it was a total failure. Even though they are in a far better financial shape than Italy, and Italy got a much better yield on their bonds, Germany's bonds failed. So this is Paul Craig Roberts saying, in my opinion, the failed German bond auction was orchestrated by the U.S. Treasury, by the European Central Bank and the EU authorities, and by the private banks that own the troubled sovereign debt. And later on down the article, so, I'm thinking, okay, so Paul Craig Roberts, the former Undersecretary of Treasury, is saying that basically the U.S. Treasury, the ECB, and the EU authorities and the private banks that make up those institutions have sabotaged Germany and German bonds. And that's a pretty big thing to say, right? So I'm thinking, why would they do that? So then he goes on later on. Certainly, this is Paul Craig Roberts, certainly President Obama does not want to go into an election year facing the prospect of high-profile U.S. financial failure. So, without any doubt, the U.S. Treasury wants Germany out of the way of a European bailout. And of course, since then, President Obama has said, okay, we are going to do our part to do whatever it takes to prop up Europe. Okay, so that kind of gave a lot of validity to Paul Craig Roberts. Interestingly enough, the IMF, this is a report, the IMF is drawing up a £500 billion package to save Italy, Spain, and the euro. So here comes the IMF, which is largely Japanese and American banks, the two biggest debtor nations in the world. And this is from the Telegraph, co.uk, and it says basically that Britain itself only provides 4.5% of IMF's funding and would be willing to help finance the 4.5%. This would explain why you saw last week, we talked about on Mark David's show, how Cameron of Britain was chastised by Merkel from Germany. Who are you? Go get in your corner, doggy. Well, they only provide 4.5% of the IMF's money, which is all derivative money. The IMF. Again, largely Japanese and American banks who are the largest debtor nations in the world. So what does this mean? It means the IMF isn't going to do anything. Okay, but they did create a new liquidity line. This new line of liquidity. And this is from foxbusiness.com. And this was from last week. And it says, the precautionary and liquidity line, the PLL, it could be used under a 12 to 24 month arrangement with access up to 1,000% of a member's quota for European countries to borrow from. So this is getting pretty insane here. What is this? What does all this mean? Well, basically what all this means is that obviously what's happening in Europe is that they're so soaked in debt. And the solution, which the new leaders who are from Goldman Sachs are telling Europe will be, the new solution is that here's the new liquidity line from the International Monetary Fund, made up of U.S. and Japanese banks mostly, leveraged up to 1,000%. And here Paul Craig Roberts is saying, like, okay, so they're turning to Germany to bail out Europe, and yet the U.S. Treasury and the ECB have sabotaged Germany's way of raising money because they don't want Germany to have the leverage to say yes or no to any country. They have to keep this going. So where is this all leading to? What, you know, this is the same old dog and pony show we keep going back and forth between the United States and Europe. Well, I'm glad you asked that. Because here's an article from Press TV. Italy water privatization. It says the Italian government's decision to sell the water supply is part of plans to deal with the country's economic crisis. It sees the privatization as essential to financing better services, while opponents say it will lead to higher prices. So, you have the IMF stepping in with no money. They have no money. They are the brokest banks in the world, the IMF. Stepping in with a liquidity line of 1,000% leveraged. But meantime, they're privatizing everything, including the water of Italy. It's like this is crazy. Like, they're going to privatize everything. They're not just going to privatize the rails. They're not just going to privatize, you know, the land, the farmland. I mean, that's bad enough. So when you hear these people talking about countries losing their sovereignty, they're not just losing their sovereignty, they're losing their water. Okay, so speaking of the IMF, I want to play for you a reminder. I know anyone listening to the Mark David Show has certainly heard this guy talk. His name is John Perkins. But I want to go over this a little bit about the IMF and what they do and kind of how it works. John Perkins wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is just a little reminder, taste of how this works and how the IMF leads to water privatization and other things such as that. Here we go.
And then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, in addition to our corporations, but really don't help the majority of the people at all. However, those people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt. It's such a big debt they can't repay it, and that's part of the plan. That they can't repay it, to have their electric utility company privatized and their water and sewage system privatized and sold to U.S. corporations or other multinational corporations. So there was that whole mushrooming thing, and it's so typical of the way the IMF and the World Bank work, that you put a country in debt, it's such a big debt it can't pay it, and then you offer to refinance that debt and pay even more interest, and you demand this quid pro quo, which you call a conditionality or good governance, which means basically that they've got to sell off their resources, including many of their social services, their utility companies, their school systems sometimes, their penal systems, their insurance systems, to foreign corporations. So it's a double, triple, quadruple whammy.
Exactly. That was John Perkins, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And this guy, everybody knows who he is by now. But I just wanted to play that as just a little reminder that what he said is very, very true, and we're actually witnessing it in Europe. Anglo-Saxon Empire. It was okay for Americans, it seemed like, for the Neo-Roman Empire, Anglo-Saxon Empire. It was okay when it was third world countries, and you know what? We need their resources. They're sitting on oil. It's not our fault they're sitting on our oil. You know, that was okay then. Now it's actually happening to people who speak like us and look, you know what I'd be saying? Like, speak the same language, have similar lifestyle. Yeah, and it's creeping over here. Now, again, Italy's a huge holder of gold. Theoretically, Italy should be a wealthy country. It's the debt. The debt. Now, speaking of debt, someone who has been completely complicit in helping the banks as much as he possibly can throughout his entire career, Barney Frank, is bailing on this ship. And I think this is interesting. The reason why it's interesting that Barney Frank is leaving now, sure, he's had a long career. By the way, that's Barney Frank is a Democrat representative from Massachusetts. He has a long career. He's, sure, he could be just retiring for normal reasons, or he could also be retiring simply because, just as the Jeffrey Skilling of Enron retired or left the building, as a famous statement by Jim Chanos, the hedge fund manager who kind of pointed the press towards Enron and made a fortune shorting Enron before it collapsed. You know, when he says when the rats start leaving the ship, that's when you really want to start shorting things. That's where things start getting interesting. So, okay, maybe these two are not connected. But you have Fitch saying, okay, we are probably going to start downgrading the U.S. pretty soon, right after the chief rat takes a swim. I don't know. Maybe they're connected, maybe they're not. They probably are. So here we are. I know I talk a lot about Europe, but of course, as I've been talking about the Mark David Show for a long time, and as average American people are starting to kind of wake up to, Europe and the United States banks are so interlocked that you can't tell them apart. And as Paul Craig Roberts is saying in his article, you know, it's to the point now, a re-election term, you can't risk letting Europe collapse right now. However, there's a really good chance that Europe's going to collapse right now. There's warnings in Europe right now about civil unrest is almost pretty much an inevitability right now. Simply because an economic collapse over there is pretty much inevitable. Now, the thing of it is as you see, the United States and Europe keep going back and forth in the news. Back and forth. And so what's that all about? Why is it Europe? Oh, problems in Europe for a while. Oh, problems over in America for a while. Problems in Europe for a while. Problems in America for a while. Well, simply that each time there's those issues, there's another bailout. There's another round of quantitative easing. When Occupy Wall Street first started in the United States, England just turned on their printing presses and they did their version of QE2. And of course, now that the Europe crisis is hitting, has been in the news especially last few weeks. Oh, it's going to collapse any second now. It's going to collapse. Well, now there's all this. There's this new revelation of how the Federal Reserve has made private loans secret loans. It's been doing that all this time. And that's just where we're at in this. But who at this point can't piece this together? That we have these banks that have no money, that are gobbling up private assets, including water, and as John Perkins says, sometimes even private school systems. And so they're just continuing bailouts to do this.